Hello, everybody. This is Aaron Rosari. I'm back to talk to you about this week's lesson. Here we go. Or this week's reading. Stem cell research on embryonic persons is just. I actually wrote this article back in 2009. I was just coming out of my doctoral program at Arizona State University. Embryonic stem cell research was just starting to really take off. And it raises, as we shall see, or perhaps as you have seen, a lot of the same ethical issues as the pro-life, pro-choice debate over abortion. At the end of the video, I'll say a couple things about why these debates are different in some ways and similar in others. But more recently, actually back in February, the Supreme Court in the state of Alabama ruled that even embryos are children, meaning they ruled that they're full-fledged persons with basic human rights. The context of that debate, of that court case, basically a couple had gone in for in vitro fertilization, and the clinic damaged some of their embryos, and they were filing a wrongful death suit against the clinic. So when the Supreme Court ruled on this, they actually ruled that all embryos are actually persons. Okay. I adopt this position for the sake of argument in the article. I actually don't think embryos are persons. But since we're adopting that assumption for the sake of argument, we'll just say a little bit about why that's at least plausible they are, at least not crazy to think they are. And then we'll look at the argument that even if they're persons, uh, it's actually not unjust to kill them because you're not actually harming them in a morally relevant way. So it's kind of a paradoxical result. Killing the embryo is not a form of harming it. Why is that? Uh, Actions tend to be wrong if they take away our freedom, or if they take away goods we would otherwise have, or if they harm us in some way. And I'm going to argue that none of those apply to embryos. Um, Hence, in a way, they're unharmable, at least the ones that are involved in vitro fertilization. Okay, so let's see how this goes. All right, so I'm going to address two preliminary issues. One regards the nature of personhood, and one is in regards to what it means to give an argument based on a justice consideration as opposed to a more what is called utilitarian or consequence-based consideration. Okay, so preliminary issue number one, what is a person? A person is a conscious, intelligent, problem-solving being that's social in nature. So normally functioning human adults and children, those are our paradigm cases of persons. But if you've seen any good, science fiction movies, take, for example, E.T. that involved an intelligent and social alien. Well, E.T. is also depicted as a person. More controversially, the nation of India wrote into law that dolphins are persons. And that's a borderline case because dolphins are conscious, they're very social, they engage in a lot of problem solving, but that comes in degrees. Just how intelligent and problem solving capable a species is a matter of degree, and it's unclear if they're over the threshold or not. Um, in any case, the basic notion of a person is a conscious, intelligent, problem-solving being that is social in nature. Now, you might think, look at the second bullet here, that embryos are not conscious or intelligent. So why think they are persons? And the answer given to this question is kind of that last point. The embryo contains the biological bases for the development of these traits, consciousness, intelligence, our social traits, including our emotional life. And hence, they might be a lot like an unconscious person. So, if you revisit the definition of person stated here, it's pretty clear upon reflection that you don't have to be conscious right now to be a person. Like you might get hit over the head and be knocked out. If you were in that state, you wouldn't be conscious, and you'd still be an intelligent, problem-solving being that's social in nature, even though you didn't have those abilities right at that moment. The idea is once you recover from getting a head injury, you would regain all those traits. Similarly, even though the embryo is not intelligent, it's not conscious, some people argue it's a person because when it develops, it will gain all those traits based on what it is. It's a genetically human being, and that's part of the natural growth process of a human being to gain those personal traits. So it's not too much of a stretch to consider the embryo a person already. Um, and then we just have to modify the definition of person at the top of the page of the slide in a plausible way. We could say a person is a being who is potentially conscious, potentially problem solving, and social in nature. And again, we could dive really deeply into this. It's not clear that the embryo is a person for reasons I'm not quite mentioning at the moment, because we're not doing a whole unit on personhood. Um, but you get the basic idea. It's not a crazy thought that an embryo is a person. Okay, so let's move forward. Preliminary issue number two, before we get to the main argument, is identifying what it means to make a justice-based argument. Okay? To show that so justice basically means fair, and if you're making a justice-based argument, you're showing that whatever you do to a specific individual doesn't give them the short end of the stick, doesn't violate any interests they have, doesn't violate any rights they have, such as a right to life. So the focus is on the person most directly affected by your action and making sure that that action isn't bad for them. Okay. And that's the main way you show that a course of action is just. Now, sometimes, of course, you can have just actions that do have bad results for people. That's usually because you're trying to prevent some worse result, or you're in an impossible situation. So you can you can have a good reason for needing to do something harmful, but that's something you always have to justify. Okay. Um, there's another type of moral argument called utilitarian or consequentialist. And the idea there is to show that an action or course of action or policy is good for people in general. And it's easy to show that embryonic stem cell research is beneficial to the public at large. That's that second point. A lot of research projects are underway that use stem cells for therapeutic purposes. They show great promise, especially for things like central nervous system injuries. Uh, there's researchers trying to figure out if stem cells can become replacement brain cells, especially for people with like Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's. So the potential is enormous, and every day you learn about some new procedure or application that has benefit for someone. So it's easy to show that embryonic stem cell research is beneficial to the public at large, but we also want to make sure we aren't violating any of the embryo's rights to live and develop when we perform embryonic stem cell research. There is a primer on stem cells I posted, more information than you could possibly want. It's 26 pages. You're not actually expected to read it. I just wanted to leave it there as a resource. Okay. Now, instead of systematically going through each of the reading questions I assigned, all I'm going to do is give the main argument of the paper and just kind of explain each premise and why it leads to the conclusion. So go ahead and take a second and read the main argument. P stands for premise. So P1 is premise one, and C stands for the conclusion of the argument. So I'm just going to sit here silently and you can read it. All right. So hopefully you've had a chance to get through all three premises and the conclusion. And now we're going to walk through each premise, explain it a little more, and then say something about the conclusion and how this debate relates to the debate over abortion. Okay, here we go. All right, so premise one read, deliberately killing an innocent person is wrong if and only if the act of killing causes them pain or their death prevents them from having future goods they otherwise would have had. Okay, so what we're focusing on here is an action being wrong because of its effect on the person who's the recipient of that action. Uh, I could have added a third category here, C. If you do something to one person and a bunch of other people are harmed by it, even just being extremely upset about it would count, uh, but for good reasons. Um, then that would be another way of harming or for deliberately killing an innocent person being wrong. Uh, Given the nature of embryonic stem cell research, people haven't really formed an attachment to the embryos created in petri dishes. So that's not really going to apply to the argument. This idea that by harming those embryos, you're harming other people who care about those embryos. That's not a huge concern because again, most of these are either leftover from in vitro fertilization. We'll talk about that more later, or they're specifically created in a petri dish for this research, and there's not people out there who are personally attached to these embryos. Okay, so we're just focused. So this premise, what it does focus on, or what it assumes, and this is that bullet point, this premise assumes that each person has a right to not be deliberately harmed. Now, harm is a broad category. Um, so you can be harmed by being physically injured. You can be harmed by someone causing you emotional distress. You can be harmed um, by people taking away resources and opportunities from you. So A and B in conjunction are supposed to capture all the ways you as an individual can be harmed by an action. So you can be caused pain. Um, that's the obvious way. Emotional, physical, so on and so forth. B turns out to be the more important one. So even if someone were to take your life in a really painless way, B would still apply. Your death would prevent you from having future goods you otherwise would have had. So you're losing the rest of your life. The rest of your life contains a lot of goods. And that's the main reason, or the most important reason, that killing an innocent person or murder is wrong. That's the wrong making property. You're depriving people of goods they would otherwise have had. Okay. So I'm not claiming here, actually, I'm claiming the following is not the case. I'm not saying it's just intrinsically wrong to ever kill anyone. The claim is it's almost always wrong to kill people because you harm them in one of these two ways. So if you take away the harms, then you don't have a reason to avoid ending a being's life if neither of these were to apply. Okay. Let's look at P2. Uh, so premise one stated two ways a being can be harmed. Premise two is going to deal with one of those ways in relation to embryos, and premise three is going to deal with the other in relation to embryos. So premise two simply says embryonic stem cell research does not cause the embryo pain. And these two sentences explain why. An embryo lives in a petri dish. So typically eggs are extracted from the woman, sperm is extracted from a man, the egg gets fertilized, and if it's used right away, it's just put in a little round dish with some nutrients in it, so it keep experiencing cell division, or its cells can keep dividing. It's not really experiencing anything. And then about 5 days in, uh, the cells are taken out of the embryo, which results in the death of the embryo. But 5 days in, and for a long period after, the embryo has no brain or central nervous system, and hence it cannot feel pain. It's just a non-conscious being at that point. So premise two is easy to defend. There's no consciousness, there's no nervous system. Therefore, embryonic stem cell research does not cause the embryo pain. All right. So premise three is where all the money is. So this is the most important premise in the argument. Embryonic stem cell research does not prevent the embryonic person from having future goods they otherwise would have had. Okay, now there's two sources of embryos for embryonic stem cell research. Uh, that first bullet point covers embryos that are specifically created, again, in a petri dish for the purposes of embryonic stem cell research. Now, each human being, you, me, the embryos, uh, it's that specific combination of sperm and egg that generates a unique embryonic person, or in the case of normal reproduction, that eventually generates a fully functioning human person. Okay? Um, the fact that a unique sperm and a unique egg have to get together to bring about a specific individual is the key to the argument. So remember what we're arguing, that if that embryonic person didn't live in the petri dish, um, it couldn't have lived anywhere else. Not theoretically. Theoretically, it could have been in utero and developed, but practically speaking, there's just no realistic possibility of the embryo, which was specifically created in the petri dish, to live inside, in utero and develop into a full-fledged functioning human person. That's why embryonic stem cell research does not prevent the embryonic person from having future goods. Notice that last part, they otherwise would have had. The only relevant alternative for the embryo, besides brief existence in a petri dish, is to not exist at all. And in the article, I go a little more in depth here, just think of what would need to happen for this embryonic person to have existed again in utero so it can continue to develop. The man who donated the sperm, the woman who donated the egg, they would have had to get together under very different circumstances, even though they're most likely strangers. They would have had to, have made love or at least lust at the exact right time. That specific sperm would have had to win the race, the lottery, so to speak. So you're talking one in trillions type odds of a specific sperm and a specific egg that were merged in a petri dish coming together under more natural circumstances. So that's why there was zero probability or near zero probability that they would have this other alternative of continuing to develop and grow. Okay. Now, the other source of embryos for embryonic stem cell research are those that are left over from in vitro fertilization. So, so this is like if you go to a fertility clinic, let's say two people are trying to produce a baby together. Typically, this is a married couple, but not always. Um, so again, the man donates the sperm, the woman the egg, unless, of course, maybe you need someone else's sperm or different eggs, but you can get more complicated than that. Uh, but a bunch of embryos are created at once. The reason this is done is because you have to uh, get the eggs, obviously, from the woman's body. That's a very invasive procedure. So if you're going to do such a procedure, you're going to grab a bunch of eggs at once. Maybe grab is not the right word. Um, and those eggs will quickly decay unless they're fertilized. So let's say a woman goes in for surgery, she has many of her eggs removed, and they all have to be fertilized right away so they don't decay. And then they're stored in a freezer. And then when they're ready to be implanted, um, they get implanted. And if the procedure works out, the embryo continues to develop it the way a normal fetus would. If it doesn't work out, then maybe the couple tries again. Okay, so once a couple has successfully conceived, they will often not use the leftover eggs. And those eggs are either going to eventually become freezer burnt or they can be used for this sort of research. But there's no one out there, there's no other women out there who want to use those eggs to get themselves pregnant. I mean, that's just not how these things are done. Um, it's theoretically possible, but it's not something anyone ever chooses. So the same facts apply to embryos that are left over from in vitro fertilization. There's virtually zero probability that they could have developed and had a normal human future. That was never in the cards. So when you use them for embryonic stem cell research, you're not depriving them of future goods they might have had. And this last point here is just emphasizing that premise three is even more important than premise two. Um, the worst harm that occurs in the case of murder is that deprivation of future goods the person would otherwise have had. If there are no such goods, then the main reason murder's wrong, it just doesn't apply to the situation. All right. So the conclusion is deliberately killing an embryonic person is not wrong and is therefore morally permissible. All I want to note about the conclusion is that it follows strictly from the premises. So let's go back to the main argument. If premise one, premise two, and premise three are all true, then this conclusion just simply follows. So premise one states the conditions under which killing an innocent person is wrong. Premise two says that first condition doesn't apply. Premise three says the second condition doesn't apply. So if that's all true, the conclusion must be true as well. Okay. Now, just briefly, I just want to point out that I think it's relatively easy to justify embryonic stem cell research, even on the assumption that the embryos are persons. You've just seen the argument. Um, it doesn't follow that it's easy to justify, for example, abortion. So, what they have in common is they're both right to life issues. What they don't have in common is the conditions under which the embryo exists. So in abortion, obviously the embryo is already in utero. Uh, so when you kill the embryo, you can make a case that you are depriving it of future goods it otherwise would have had. You can make that argument. Um, but you can't really make that argument with embryonic stem cell research. So all that's to say that even if you have strong pro-life inclinations in regards to abortion, it brings up different issues than embryonic stem cell research. So you can have one view on stem cell research and another view on abortion. Um, Abortion's actually harder to justify, and of course that's its own discussion. So we're not going to like do it in summary form than embryonic stem cell research. All right. So sorry, my computer just told me the battery is about to click off, so I better plug it in. So I'm going to post this, and I'm also setting up a discussion board that'll be due next Wednesday. All right, thank you much.